What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia!
And Victoria.
We are two lifelong friends who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and use books as tools for personal and community growth.
This week, we're reading The Wisdom of Your Body, Finding Healing, Wholeness, and Connection Through Embodied Living by Dr. Hilary L. McBride about her research and experience in clinical psychology related to how our minds and our bodies are interconnected.
So this was the first ARC, or advanced reading copy, that Julie and I received from an author that we were like already a big fan of, and it was so exciting.
It was like the biggest day of our professional podcasting careers to date.
Yeah, we've had many lovely people reach out promoting books that we haven't heard of, or authors that we were just being introduced to for the first time. So to have like a publishing agent who's like, hey, here's a book from this person that you follow and read all their stuff, and they want you to read it early, I was like, oh my goodness.
Like that we were considered valuable enough, like that we could add something to her promotion, like that we were being equated in any way is like mind-boggling, and I'm so grateful that we got sent this book. They sent it all the way to Belgium for me. I just wanted to point that out.
Kudos to her publishing agent who was like, yep, okay, it's coming to Belgium.
Yeah, we were like, we'll say that I'm in Belgium, but like that it's okay if they just send one and it's fine. We'll figure it out. They mailed it to Belgium. It was the first mail I got here, and it was so excited. I felt so important. Anyway, what was your experience reading this book, Victoria?
So this book I was, again, so excited to read, and I saw Dr. McBride promoting it, that she was writing it, and like following her journey on Instagram, being like, my book is finished, it's on its way, here's the cover. So it was really exciting to like get to read it, but I think I definitely read this in like not the right way, if there is a right way to read a book. I don't think it's a book to read on a deadline, which is what Julie and I tend to do for this podcast, because it's definitely one that you want to sit with, maybe be uncomfortable with, reflect on, stop and like practice the techniques, ask yourself the questions. On one hand, I think it's good I had a deadline, because it might have been one of those books that I read a chapter and set it down for 3 months and then pick it up again and have to remind myself what I'm reading. But it did kind of feel like a fire hose of information to try to read it in like a 2-week span while reading other books. But I definitely did take some time for like personal reflection. There were some times that I was like I knew I should probably sit with something because of the way it felt to read it. But then I was like plowing ahead, like quote unquote, for the sake of the podcast to like read it, which might have also been like maybe a defense mechanism in a way to not have to deal with certain things that I felt coming up. This book is in a way like an overview of a lot of things that I've been reading and we've been talking about lately, like in our personal life off mic, as far as like therapy and trauma, body image, physical and mental health, oppression, ableism. And I really appreciated Dr. McBride's ability to go deep into these and explain like the psychological concepts behind a lot of the therapy work that she does with patients or clients, as well as sharing like her own personal experiences and how that ties into a lot of this. And I did appreciate her kind of like nod to the reader throughout almost the whole book of like, take what is helpful and leave the rest behind. You know, like if this feels like it resonates with you in your experience with trauma or your experience with oppression, that's awesome. But like not trying to like be a end all be all for the topic of embodiment.
Yeah, reading it on a deadline, I feel like I did something very similar. I'm going to do my best not to call her Hillary because we talk about her like she's our friend. But I want her to be shown respect in this episode. So I will try to call her Dr. McBride. Like you were saying, like this book is meant to be interacted with and experienced. And she has talked about how she wants you to mark it up and she wants you to practice things and check in how certain things make you feel. And she like tells you to do it. You know, it's like a very interactive book. And so I tried to at first. And then somewhere in the first chapter, when she's describing her experience with the car accident and then the recovery process and new things she discovered in therapy, I was like very sensitive to it and very emotional about it. I had some very strong reactions that I did not expect. And it was very jarring. Like it suddenly made me feel a bit unsafe, maybe, you know, that like I wasn't prepared to experience those feelings. And so the sudden presence of them was very uncomfortable. As good as it was, or cathartic as it was, maybe, I was like, whoa, what is that? And so then I like felt myself in later passages. I would literally like write in the notes, like I can feel myself actively turning off or distancing myself from this information so that I don't have an emotional reaction to it, so that I can keep reading and finish the book. It was very much like I can't process this right now, because if I do, I will not finish it and I will not stop crying and I need to go to sleep, or, you know, I need to go to class or something. Like it was, yeah, I definitely didn't engage with the book the way it was meant to be. And I'll talk about this more, but I tend to, something I think I maybe discovered in the process of reading this book, that I tend to disregard my own feelings or tell myself that they're not real, or tell myself, hey, that's too bad, suck it up, we gotta keep going kind of things, because I'm just so sensitive to so many things. I feel like if I stopped and let myself experience the full feeling wave, I would never do anything. And so I just kind of turned everything off and pushed through, and there were certain sections where I could feel myself reading faster, because if I even thought about it for 2 seconds, I would get emotional about it. And like at the end, I was like, I definitely did that wrong. And yeah, so I think that's going to affect how I talk about this book. I feel like I'm going to be a bit detached from it. But the ideas were very helpful. And so I'm excited to talk about them and maybe reflect on them in smaller chunks at a later date when I feel safe to do so.
Yeah, in a way, it's almost like signing up to go to therapy. Like, you don't have 10 sessions with your therapist back to back to back, squeezed in throughout your day, like right before you go to bed, or like right before you go to something else. Like sometimes, especially with telehealth, like you can kind of quote unquote squeeze in therapy throughout your day. But like when I was going really regularly with telehealth, like it would be scheduled for an hour, but we'd only talk for 50 minutes. So I always had 10 minutes of my calendar blocked off as unavailable, where I could like go decompress and like get ready to like process whatever had been talked through, or, you know, write down some notes to think about during the week, and then like gradually move on with my day. Or I'd schedule it at the end of the day when I like, you know, didn't have to rush off to something else. So I feel like this book would maybe, if there is a quote right way to read it, it would be to do like one chapter a week and like treat it as your like therapy time in a way. If you're going to sit with the questions and reflect and kind of like let your body move through the information in a way that you can soak it all in. But I don't know, maybe there's other people who are like ready to get into it and talk about it and think about it, and it doesn't require them to slow down to that slow of a pace to read it. But that was my experience looking back on how quickly I read it. I'm like, maybe if I gave myself like a week per chapter.
Yeah.
Which I can always reread it. I think it'd be a good reread.
Oh, for sure.
So we've talked a lot about Dr. McBride as the author of this, but a little bit more about her background. Dr. Hilary L. McBride is a therapist, researcher, speaker, and writer. She holds a PhD in counseling psychology from the University of British Columbia, as well as Masters of Arts in Counseling Psychology. On her website, she writes, quote, "I love to help see people grow, heal, change, and come into more fullness in themselves and their relationships. I'm passionate about the well-being of all people and want to make psychology and academic research accessible to a wide variety of people." You may recognize her name from our previous episode where we discussed her first book, Mothers, Daughters, and Body Image. That was episode 19, very early days of our pod. My mom
Such
and
a
I
long
sat down
time
to
ago.
discuss that one. And Dr. McBride is formerly a host on the Liturgist podcast, and she currently hosts the popular CBC podcast, Other People's Problems. The podcast brings listeners into actual therapy sessions with Dr. McBride and some of her long-term clients. They changed the names of those clients for privacy reasons, but it's like you get to listen in on someone's therapy session, which I find very fascinating. And I think also really helps you have an insight into what therapy could look like for yourself if you aren't quite sure what to expect.
I wonder what the levels of ethics and paperwork there are, like, to make sure that you're being ethical in that process, because I think that is very, very cool and also very personal for someone. So, like,
Yeah.
they obviously have to consent to do it.
Oh, yeah. They're completely aware they're being recorded.
But that's fascinating to me. So this book, to summarize, Dr. Hillary McBride walks us through what she's learned as a researcher on embodiment, a practicing psychologist for people whose mental health is taking a toll on their bodies in some way, and as a person who has experienced multiple traumatizing incidents, most recently a horrific car accident. And her initial research into psychology was inspired by her years with an eating disorder, which she also talks about in this book. So the frame story is kind of her own experience in healing and reconnecting with her body, and then she walks us through kind of the history of how the dominant white culture became so disembodied to begin with, and all the areas that has an impact on. So there's a chapter for each of these. So there's trauma, body image, expressing emotions, pain and disability, oppression, pleasure, and spirituality. It's really literally everything.
Runs the gamut.
Yeah. And also at the end of each chapter, she gives you some questions to contemplate and some embodiment exercises to try so that you can put the teachings into practice. So that's kind of what this book is.
So in the past, when we've covered books like this, sometimes we would try to like summarize everything for the listener, and it's very tempting to do that here. Mm-hmm. But we did want to kind of focus in on what matters to us personally when we're reading this, go more of a deep dive into a few of the topics. We mentioned the whole list of topics she covers with a whole chapter each. We're going to hit on like 3 of them. So we're going to pull some of the things out of that we learned from the book that stood out to us most, and also recognize that Dr. McBride is like literally an expert at this and like explains a lot of these psychological concepts in very like thoughtful and well-written ways that we would just butcher on our own. So we'll probably reference some of the concepts or frameworks that she uses, but we'll point you back to the book to figure out exactly what those frameworks are and like who wrote about them and where they came in this research and blah, 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 all that stuff. So this is more like what resonated with us in the book. This podcast is made possible by our wonderful book club members. You can support the show by becoming a member on buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. So Julie and I are readers. We like to talk about books, but we're also writers. And so with our book club members, we love to share newsletters of things happening in our personal lives, as well as essays, poetry, other things we're writing. So starting at $3 per month, book club members can connect with fellow listeners, help us select books for future episodes, unlock exclusive newsletters, poems, etc. that we write, and get early and discounted access to future events. If you want to take your support to the next level, you can also join the TISM tier, which starts at $5 per month. The TISM tier is all about autism. Are you an autistic person looking for community, a possible neurodiverse person looking for resources, or an ally hoping to learn from an actually autistic person? Members of this tier get access free to Julia's autism-related articles on Medium. The best part of any book club, besides the books, is the community. So join us in our growing community of book nerds by becoming a member of the book club today. You can follow the link in our show notes or go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv to join the party. Now back to the books.
So maybe to start, set the framework here. What do we mean by embodiment and disembodiment?
Yeah. So Dr. McBride defines her audience at the beginning as primarily Western culture. As Julia mentioned, that like dominant white Western culture specifically is very disembodied in many ways, which is kind of a disconnect between our mind and our body. And she traces it through like religion and society and politics and how we have made our minds like so important
Mm-hmm.
and so separate and different than our bodies. We've kind of broken the connection between the two. And she recognizes that her field of psychology is just one of many that teach us about embodiment. So bringing the mind and the body together and understanding ourselves as a full being, not just our thoughts or not just a body, but both together. And psychology is even kind of like late to the party when it comes to this. There are so many Eastern traditions and indigenous traditions that are already speaking to this topic and have been for centuries. So it's recognized that like this is specifically writing to an audience that has been culturally disembodied for a long time, kind of noting where that is and offering a selection of tools, by no means a definitive array of them, but some tools to help people who are steeped in white dominant Western culture find, like as she says in the subtitle, finding healing, wholeness, and connection through embodied living.
Yeah. It's not even that there's like a separation between mind and body, but we've created a hierarchy, right?
Mm.
So it starts with Plato, where he thinks that the mind and the body are distinct, and then you see that sort of permeate itself through Christianity and then kind of solidify in the Enlightenment. And through each stage, the mind gains more and more importance. And the body becomes more and more dirty and like associated with all the negative things, right? And so it creates this kind of war within yourself. And it makes you like not like and distrust your own feelings and your own experiences, and it makes you hate your pain and your sadness and your happiness. And you're like the patients that she works with, one of the examples she gives is like this like 40-year-old man with a heart condition who they'd done some medical interventions, but they also felt that he needed some psychological intervention because his mind and body were so disconnected that he didn't realize how much stress he was putting his body under. He couldn't feel it, essentially, and so they needed to reestablish that relationship in a way. Each of the chapters goes through like how that hierarchy has affected every aspect of life and how to start mending it. And something I found really fascinating is she suggests that potentially the increasing popularity of non-Western cultural ideas and practices, most famously yoga, that increasing popularity is a result of white people having this subconscious like understanding that there's something missing and that they are not connected to their body and they don't know how to fix it and they're trying to find something to fix it. But because they're not really aware of what's happening, or like they end up putting all the problematic fat shaming and hustle culture like right back into the yoga practice, right? And making it something that it wasn't intended to be, and making it about losing weight and stuff. So I found that really, really fascinating because I was like, yeah, that checks out to me. We're kind of starting to understand that we need to fix this, but there isn't enough language yet to like put it into practice.
And she names very quickly, and we recognize too, that there is a huge paradox in reading, a very mind-centered activity, about being more connected to our bodies. Like, so often on this podcast, we talk about books that we loved because of the escapism, you know, like, oh, it's so interesting to like enter this fantasy world, and like, it's all in our minds reading, and we're not living it in our bodies necessarily. So it's duly noted that this is a very mind-centered activity to learn about how to be more connected to our bodies. But I think, as we kind of talked about already in our experience reading the book, it did bring up feelings in our bodies. And even as I was reading it, my partner was sitting next to me and he's like, "You're breathing so loudly." I'm like, "What?" I was reading about connecting with my breath, and I just started like very deeply breathing and like it was like interesting to see how like reading about something like automatically triggered a response in my body to like do it as well. Yeah, it was fascinating.
Yeah, I enjoyed that she pointed that out, that she's like, I'm using language, which is such a front brain thing. Like if you remember Your American Pain in the Ass with Mike McCarg, he talks about the brain burrito, right? The front brain, the neocortex that has the language, is just the tortilla, and like most of the good stuff on the inside is like deeper brain stuff that doesn't have to do with language. That's where all the feelings are, and the nervous, like the brain stem that does all the keeps you alive. So it's a very, very small part of our brain-body system that the hierarchy that we've created prioritizes language as a means of communication. And so it is kind of funny to write a book about embodiment. But I think I do think so many people, myself included, read books because they don't want to be their body in this space because their friends are fictional, or, there's a fictional place where they're safer than where they are right now, or there's a place where people understand them or something, and no one understands them here. Yeah, so I feel like, people who are book people have that kind of association with books. I even think about Zaf from Taking It Danny Brown last episode, where he literally reads books to calm his anxiety and escape his anxious thoughts. So anyway, I feel like that's a very common association. But she does a lot of work to combat that. As we mentioned earlier, she puts in tons of exercises and reminds you to check in with your body all the time and asks you a bunch of questions and gives you things to try. And she tells you, like, I want you to mark this up. I want you to interact with it as much as possible. So she does a really good job of trying to make it as interactive as she can.
In some ways, it's like a very self-aware book. Because
yes.
The book will, like, she'll write things like, stop for a moment, read these sentences, what comes to mind. Like, you can blow past it, but it's, like, very hard because she's, like, talking directly to you. Like, I know you're sitting there reading me, so I'm going to tell you something and you're going to stop. It's kind of like I've seen some people post to their, like, Instagram story or their Instagram feed of, like, this is your daily reminder to, like, go take a break. Like, put the phone down. Like, the world is outside. And every time I see that, I'm like, oh, yeah, you're right. Like, I tend to do it. I'm like, whoever randomly in my feed that posted that, thank you. I'm turning off my phone now and, like, going to go do something. Or, like, TV commercials for, like, opting outside, going outside when it's, like, they're meeting people where they're at. Like, she's meeting all these readers who might feel very disconnected to their bodies, and they go to books as a source of information. And she's like, haha, now that I've got you in my book, I'm ready to tell you to put it down.
Oh, that's such a good point. Yeah, it's meeting people where they're at. This is where we're going to go. Oh, that's great.
So one of the sections of the book that we wanted to go a little more in depth on is chapter 4, Appearance and Image, How We See Our Body from the Outside. And she introduces this idea of body object versus body subject. So when we talk about our bodies as objects of whatever is happening versus the subject, like we being ourselves. So maybe it's the grammar nerd in me that is like, oh man, this makes so much sense. The object of a sentence versus the subject of a sentence. Like, right. You center the subject, but you do things to the object. And I just really appreciated this language because I think this is something I'm, like, actively living through for a while now. So I don't necessarily have all the words to talk about my experience yet, but, like, I've just become extremely uncomfortable with any sort of body-focused conversation because I don't know how to talk about my body without talking about it as an object. Like, I haven't yet been able to fully immerse myself in this body-subject mindset. And so I will just shut down conversations about my body because I don't know how to, like, do anything else with it except avoid it completely. This is something I'm actively working on, and being able to talk about how my body feels, like how physical activity feels in my body, how to talk about body changes without making the conversation completely body object. There's, like, so much to unlearn for me there.
Yeah.
And even while I was, like, reading this book and, like, putting more effort behind thinking through, and I mean, it's something I've been doing for years now, like, I still, like, stumble and do, like, weird things. I just, like, shut down conversations. Like, recently I saw someone I hadn't seen in, like, 4 years. And they said they didn't recognize me at first and noted immediately that I had lost weight since they last saw me. And it was extremely awkward. And I just said, like, thank you. And then, like, moved the conversation along. And then I just started kicking myself internally. I'm like, why am I thanking this person for saying that? Also, they didn't even compliment it. They just, like, made a comment that my body had changed. And so ultimately I just, like, moved on to something else because I, like, was frazzled and I didn't know how to, like, even acknowledge really what they said, and just kind of, like, blew past it, which maybe is the best I can do for now.
Yeah. So in your attempt to not talk negatively about yourself or not talk about yourself like an object, you haven't figured out how to talk about it like a subject or positively? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, especially, like, when someone else starts the conversation. I think
right.
with myself internally, I have language, or if I'm having a longer in-depth conversation with like you as a friend, like I feel like I have more language around it and and a safer environment to like, I don't know, we've even had conversations where I'm like, oh, Julia, I had this feeling today where I was really excited that this old skirt from high school fit me. Should I be excited? Like, does it align with my values and where I want to be, like, mentally with my idea of, like, appearance?
That is an actual conversation that we've had.
It is an actual conversation we had. But I feel, like, very safe in our friendship to be able to have that conversation. I think it's the external, like, everyday side conversations, random comments that are about bodies that I'm just like, and then I, like, don't engage.
Yeah, because it's hard to know what people mean. Like that observation someone made about your body. Was it a compliment? Or what, like, it's hard to tell, like, what worldview, what framework are we in? So, yeah, that can be kind of tricky. Like, if someone else is kind of leading the conversation, I do find myself slipping into more negative tone or just complaining or whatever. Like, a trick that I learned very early on, or not very early on, I would say early adult. As an autistic person, this clicked into place for me, especially with coworkers. If you want people to like you in a place where they don't know you very well, complain with them and they will like you and they will cooperate with you in a work environment. And so that's now, like, that setting is on anytime I'm with coworkers or something along those lines. My networking essentially is complaining because that's like the only thing that I've learned so far. I don't have a networking mode. I'm either myself or I'm complaining. Like, I don't know. So if anything body related comes up in that kind of environment where I don't know people super well, I will definitely revert to that. Not really on purpose, but I'm just trying not to offend people. As for the body subject, body object thing, I was really trying to think, like, when I realized that my body was an object that existed in people's minds, because I think there was a long time when I realized that. There's different research about, like, autistic people's theory of mind, of, like, their conception of other people's thoughts, essentially. I don't know how conclusive it is. I'm curious if there was something that I just, like, didn't understand. I genuinely thought I was, like, socially invisible. Like, I would forget that people could see me and that I existed. I was disembodied as heck. So that also contributed to it. It would be really jarring when I was like, oh, you can see me? I'm here right now? Like, we're interacting? We're in the same room? That's really upsetting. But it was weirdly freeing as well, because I didn't have any understanding that people had thoughts and opinions about my body at all. And it took a while. And I feel like as I've been working on embodiment for years now, and it's made me a lot more sensitive to that, especially with the internet. So that, like, occasionally it'll dawn on me. I'm like, you mean that every single person who I don't know, who just, like, happens to scroll past that picture of me, now has an opinion? A conception of me in their head? That's like, that could be like thousands of people. I'm supposed to, like, somehow manage all that? Like, oh my god, no. I don't want to deal with that. Let alone, like, every single person who's passed me in the street would potentially recognize me if they saw me again. Not necessarily that they would, but, like, if I stood out for some reason, or I was reading a book and they noticed it, and then now they see me on the bus again and they recognize me, like, I exist in other people's minds. That's insane. So that's very stressful to me now. Yeah, I think I've kind of learned that fact the hard way. And so now I have a very, very negative association of, like, if I exist in people's minds, it's because they think something negatively about me, unless I know them well enough that they can tell me what they think. So that section I don't think I connected to as much, but it was kind of fascinating for me to explore that in myself. I also have to say, before we move on, her emphasis on the importance of media literacy for, like, noticing and combating negative body image messaging in media, she, like, put a big emphasis on it, and it just made my little book nerd heart so happy. I was like, this is why we need English majors, to teach everyone media literacy, so that we can understand that everything has a deeper agenda and a deeper message, and that, like, you know, things come from a context and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we really, like, hammered in on one element of this entire chapter on appearance. But yeah, in summary, the chapter also talks about how our concept of body as appearance is different than living in our body. So she has this whole really interesting exploration of like body positivity, body neutrality, and those movements and ideas. And I found it very thoughtful and nuanced, and like, I don't know, I resonate with a lot of it because I feel like I have also kind of run the gamut of ideas around body positivity versus body neutrality. Like, what does it mean to celebrate our bodies? But how do we even break away from this body as object? Because even body positivity or body neutrality can roll into this like body as object mentality instead of as subject. So there's a lot more to unpack there.
Yeah, I had a lot of thoughts about that. You get a similar niche of that in different parts of the disability umbrella. I've seen with, autistic people, disability in general and autism have been so demonized, right? And made out to be this, it's the end of the world. It has taken your soul. You are no longer a human being that can communicate or think thoughts, right? That's very objectifying and belittling and dehumanizing, right? So swinging away from that, people go super positive. They're like, it's not even a disability. It's just a different ability. And it's amazing. Everything about it is amazing. You're superheroes or whatever it is, right? Super positive. But again, that can be pretty dehumanizing to the people who experience real difficulty and real pain and struggle within themselves as a result of being different in a world that does not appreciate it. And so a lot of times you kind of end up wanting to find this kind of neutral place where it's just like, I'm just going to be me. I'm just going to be in my body as it is with the good and the bad and recognize that everyone's experience is different. And so that her discussion of the body positivity versus negativity versus neutrality thing was very, very familiar to me. I was like, yeah, we do the same thing in a slightly more specific way. But it is essentially that kind of body positivity idea that can still be kind of objectifying if you take it too far.
Yeah, which leads very nicely into the next sections we wanted to talk about, which is You Are Not Broken, a new perspective on pain, illness, and injury. We'll also probably be referencing a bit of the chapter on trauma, the body overwhelmed, healing the body from stress and trauma.
I really liked this chapter. And it was also difficult in certain ways because it was like, white culture is like so obsessed with rising above our pain, right? And getting out of our bodies. Like if we experience anything difficult in our bodies, it's somehow like a moral failing. Like somehow you're like, there's something wrong with you. You're a worse person on some level because you acknowledge that you experience the pain or you experience the difficulty or that the trauma still lives in your body. To the point that people will just like tell you to stop experiencing it or will deny that it's happening to you in the first place. And so since I was an even more sensitive kid than average, even something really basic like brushing my hair or brushing my teeth or drinking water were like super upsetting, and I would scream and run away from my mom and get into fights with her about it, and my hair was just like a bird's nest. It was just so tangled. I was severely dehydrated and all these, my mom had to bribe me to do stuff. But I didn't know how to like articulate what was wrong. So that was all doubled for me. The denial of experience was increased. Basically, everything I felt was somehow wrong or didn't exist. And so I would constantly be told, like, that's not real, get over it, about, like, everything I felt. And so this created, like, a really fragmented and distrustful relationship with my body that I'm really still working on. It's a real work in progress that will never be over. And so Dr. McBride in this chapter introduces this concept that she did not invent. She credits this other guy whose name I don't remember. The concept is called the second arrow. The first arrow you get shot with is the initial pain, the initial injury. But then the second arrow is the one we shoot at ourselves, is essentially like the negative response that we so often have to the pain. So if I get a migraine because there's a certain smell that I walked past that is particularly pungent, or like I'm just really sensitive that day, and now I have a migraine. The first arrow is the migraine. The second arrow is me getting very resentful and frustrated with my body. And that second arrow, according to this concept, did you find who it is?
Yeah. The original concept of the two arrows comes from a Buddhist teaching, and the researcher psychologist Ron Siegel was the one who kind of used it in his own research around pain and illness, injury, insomnia, kind of connecting it to Western psychology.
Cool. I'm glad that you brought that up because I did not remember that it was a Buddhist concept, and now I'm going to remember that. And apparently, the second arrow can cause a significant amount of damage. Like the way that we think about our bodies can completely change when and how we heal, how we cope in general. The language around it was more for like a temporary injury because it suggested that there was a complete healing process, whereas like if there's just something you live with forever, I think it complicates that a little bit. But she does address that. Like, essentially, if we change how we think about our pain, that will change how we experience it in a way. Because it's just information, right? It's just your body telling you that something happened, or that something's wrong, or that it doesn't like something, right? And it's a way to get you to then act so that you can fix it and make it better. So it's your body's way of saying, hey, pay attention to me, please. I need help.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not malicious. It's just a thing. It's just a piece of information. It's not fun. And, you know, it can have long-lasting, potentially lifelong impacts. But if you have this more compassionate stance towards that information, you can build a kinder relationship with yourself that doesn't feel as gross in your mind. And like, I know for me, there's so much resentment and frustration that's still in my head that's kind of instinctual towards my body because there's so many things that my body just can't do. So that resentment has a huge impact on how I process feelings and identify them. And I get this kind of temporary like TMJ, like my jaw stops working when I'm super overwhelmed and I push myself too far. Yeah, so I'm gonna be sensitive till the day I die, and things are gonna hurt me. Like, just ordinary things that don't bother people are going to hurt me. So I think the journey now is not being angry at Julia about that, but kind of building a relationship with myself so that we can face those things together and try to prevent and heal the harm that is done, which is extremely difficult. But
yeah,
we're going to give it a try.
This whole concept of the second arrow really, like, it definitely will be one of the things I think I will reflect on the most from this book. I've slowly come to realize over years that I've really lived and died by this push through the pain, like, you're not really sick, it's not that bad mindset, and it's really not helping me. The first step was even just recognizing it was happening. It was other people in my life who'd be like, hey, you get sick like every month and that's not normal. Like, in a very kind way, like, we care for you, like, there might be something wrong. And I'm like, wait, what do you mean it's not normal? And then, like, recognizing, like, I don't have any formal diagnosis for what's happening in my body, but, like, I know that stress and lack of sleep and overworking, like, will lead towards being, like, down and out with cold-like symptoms for days. It happens at, like, a pretty frequent interval that I was like, okay, I need to make some changes in my life. And other things, too. Like, I made other steps in other areas of my life, like going to therapy for anxiety, going to physical therapy for, like, knee and back pain. And so it was, like, awesome. I'm like, cool, I'm getting all these tools. I'm learning about my body. I'm learning about my mind. And, like, I know ways to better prevent flare-ups and, like, better cope with anxiety or difficult situations. So I'm like, cool, step 1, check. But now step 2 is like learning to stop that second arrow, because now I fire it all the time because I'm like, Victoria, you're awful at taking care of yourself. Like, you have all these tools to reduce your pain and your illness and you're not doing it. You failed, you suck, which is like also not helpful when a lot of the root of my illness that I experience is because of stress and tension. So I'm just stressing and tensing up my body more. And I think her connection, she has these great diagrams that she uses to kind of explain how our mindset, that second arrow, can lead towards more physical tension in the body. And by acknowledging it and not shooting that second arrow or pulling back, rewriting those scripts we tell ourselves can reduce the tension in our body and ultimately, like you said, especially if something's chronic or recurring, long-lasting, it's not necessarily like, yay, fixed it, it's all gone away, but we're no longer double hitting ourselves with pain. And we can, build that kinder relationship with ourselves. One thing that happened while reading this book that was like, oh my gosh, this is such a good example of like putting some of these things in practice. I was out of town and staying at a different like Airbnb, and the bed I slept in, I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I woke up with like 20 bug bites all over my body.
Oh.
And I tend to like swell up a lot when I get bug bites, which is like okay and it happens, whatever. But like 20 and like all over my body. And I was like wildly uncomfortable for multiple days. But I was reading this book and I was kind of like just starting to practice using kinder language with my body. Like, thank you, body, for like, you're working really hard to get the bug poison out of me. And that's why I'm swelling. And that's why I'm uncomfortable, is because my body's like doing the work to like work this, bug poison out of my system. And even though it like didn't resolve the pain, it didn't necessarily make me any more comfortable. Like, I felt like I was on the same side with my body instead of being like, oh, I get so swollen. I'm just really sensitive to bug bites. Like, other people get bug bites and it's a little red dot and it's like not a huge deal. Like mine are like, the size of a golf ball or something, and I'm just like, this is disgusting and I'm gross. And it's like, no, like that's not how I want to continue talking to myself.
Yeah, I like that it's like, it's a matter of whose team you're going to be on to face the pain. Like, are you going to have your body on your side when you face this pain, or are you going to be fighting your body and the pain, or the cause of it? You know what I mean? Like, how many wars do you want to be fighting? So yeah, it doesn't get rid of the problem, but it, then you have a teammate in a sense. Oh my God, what you were saying about feeling like you have more ammunition to get mad at yourself now that you have tools to take care of yourself, because it's like, now you have no excuse.
Yeah, I used to just say like hereditary, genetics, bad knees, oops. And now it's like, no, I have all these stretches and exercises and things I can do to be stronger and like be better and not have pain. And like, it just brings all that up. When previously I might have just been like, oh, this sucks, but then what can you do about it? Shrug. Now it's like, you can do things about it. But even recognizing that even when I can do something about it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm always able to.
There are more factors. Social factors, you might say.
Yes.
That's me trying to segue into the social model of disability.
I think it's great.
Thank you. So, Dr. McBride, see there, I almost called her Hillary again. I'm catching myself right now. Dr. McBride references the social model of disability multiple times in this book by name and by description, or someone she's interviewing references it, which we've talked about multiple times on this podcast. I'll explain it in a second, but she had this quote that I really liked that I think kind of introduces it well, where she says, like, it is problematic when ability and health are defined only by those whose bodies hold the most social power. Right? So the social model of disability is looking at the way that social dynamics and power hierarchies impact someone's experience of being disabled or having a disability, however they prefer to describe it. That, yes, there is something different about your physical makeup, and perhaps that is sometimes unpleasant on its own, but the thing that makes it really suck to have a disability is actually the other people and the social structures around you that limit your access to life, or that don't treat you like a human being, or don't let you do things. Like, there are so many barriers when it comes to voting that a lot of people with disabilities just don't vote. And so we are drastically underrepresented in all levels of government because there's so many barriers to so many different disabilities when it comes to voting. So that's kind of an example. And I really liked how she tackled disability in the book. She pulled from multiple voices, and I also liked that she emphasized that I think that the chapter on pain in particular was a good reminder that, like, most everyone is going to be put under the label of disability at some point in their lives, even if it's just, like, getting old, and your body stops working in certain ways, and so you need mobility supports or whatever, you lose hearing or whatever, right? So even if it's just that, or maybe you have a serious or even minor temporary injury, right, and you need some crutches, and suddenly, like, you have to go upstairs on crutches, right? Or whatever it may be. Because ability is defined by the people who have the most social power, almost everyone's going to be labeled as disabled on some level or another throughout their lives. And so creating different kinds of access that fit everyone's needs and is incentivizing people to build that access into our public transportation systems and to our voting and our schools and our offices and all that kind of stuff is going to help everyone at some point in their lives. One of the examples that I think her friend that she interviews in a later chapter uses in the book that I think is a good example. For people who require mobility aids, people who use wheelchairs, those supports is actually incredibly freeing. Like, we use these descriptors of like being wheelchair bound or like you have to use a wheelchair or something. And there's this assumption like that you only use a wheelchair if you absolutely have to, but otherwise you're gonna walk because being stuck in a wheelchair means you're stuck or something like that. There's kind of that mentality. But actually, it's incredibly freeing because suddenly you can move without being in pain, right? You can get farther and you can live your life. But for this particular story, the thing that made this person feel not free and made them feel trapped was bus drivers wouldn't let them on the bus. So there is a ramp and there is a way for a person in a wheelchair to use the bus, but the bus drivers just would say that it was full or that it wasn't working or that, basically they just didn't want to accommodate a wheelchair. And so now that action is what made this person feel trapped, not the wheelchair itself. So I think that is a really great example. And I really liked how Hilary addressed it in the book in general and in this chapter.
I remember like the whole social model of disability really clicked for me when we were talking once and I thought about how society has made it very easy for me to live with nearsightedness.
Yeah.
Like, it's not even considered really a disability. I put on glasses, I get compliments. Someone once said they were intimidatingly cool, and that's literally it. Like, then I can see, I can go places. I have like a little thing on my driver's license saying I need corrective lenses. Cool. They don't bat an eye. They let me drive. They're like, yeah, just wear them. We trust you. Go live your life in happiness, being able to see. And it's like my accessibility aid, my glasses, is not stigmatized. Therefore, it's not seen as a disability in our society. And so if our society doesn't stigmatize people for using other accessibility aids, like you mentioned, wheelchairs or maybe like noise-canceling headphones for people with auditory sensitivities, the world would be so much less disabling for them, Like, they would be able to be less distressed in certain areas, like, because people are like, yeah, that's cool. Our society accommodates that. And then it's, like you said, there's still an element of disability. It's not like everything's perfect now. Like, there's still things that person might have to be dealing with their day-to-day life, but like, it would be so much easier in society if we created more accessible places for people to join no matter what accessibility aids they need. And I think back to when we talked about the book Invisible Women and how it's like being reminded that everything in our world, for the most part, has been designed by humans. Mm-hmm. And if it's a problem for humans to use, then design a better solution.
Yeah.
Stairs were cool, but they don't work for everyone. And you know what? A ramp isn't hard.
Yeah.
Use a ramp. Build a ramp. And we've also talked off mic a little bit about how there isn't always incentives for people to make things more accessible. So like in the example of the bus driver who's like, oh, sorry, bus is full, ramp isn't working. Like, that's kind of a shitty thing for the bus driver to do, but likely there's reasons why, maybe that bus driver they have to be on time and it's going to impact their ability to keep the job or to keep their pay if they, are consistently late, and perhaps the bus isn't designed to be easily accessible. It's just kind of accessible, but it takes like a bunch of extra time or effort to unload the ramp for the person in a wheelchair to get on board. So it's thinking about how do we as a society incentivize accessibility, and also how do we as individuals talk about, advocate for, and just in our everyday life think about how we can design and build more accessible spaces for all types of disability.
If we're talking about social systems, Look at me with these segues. I'm really killing it today. They're very obviously segues, but I'm really proud of them. That leads us right into the chapter on oppression. And I don't remember what it's called, but I'm sure you have the title.
The Body and Oppression, When Bodies Are Political.
Amazing. In this chapter, Dr. McBride essentially records like 4 conversations that she has with 4 of her friends to cover as broad of a range of experiences and different intersections of identity and what it's like being different types of bodies in this culture that really has a kind of ideal type of body and type of mind. And she makes a very important point early on in the chapter that I really liked, where she makes a distinction between constructed and concrete. So the concept of race, that there are better races than other ones, or that there are races to begin with, is constructed. That is a thing that humans invented at a certain point in our history. And gender, similar thing. So it is constructed. But it is also concrete in the sense that, yes, we made up this racist system so we can undo it, but it also is very concrete and real in people's lives. People experience very, very real, visceral consequences of this made-up thing. Even like the way that the ideas in your head have a really physical impact on your body. She even talks about that, like how words hurt our body just as much as physical violence. Mm-hmm. Language is made up, and it also causes trauma that is very physical, you know? So
yeah,
I think that's an important way of interacting with these topics.
One like specific example she gave too is that people in oppressed or marginalized groups can meet all the criteria for PTSD without actually experiencing the single life-threatening event that usually is associated with PTSD. So that these constant threats to their bodies through marginalization, oppression, kind of having that hypervigilance of feeling unsafe a lot of the time has a draining impact on the person's nervous system, that they can ultimately suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, which is usually, most commonly associated with people who've been in combat or have been victim of extreme violence. But people who experience racism in their everyday life can also carry those same consequences on their bodies. So this chapter I thought was like very important to like her overall conversation. And I also appreciated the different conversations she brought in. Obviously they can't speak to every intersection and every identity, but they bring it a lot more than what Dr. McBride could offer on her own.
Right.
As a like cis white woman. I really like this quote that you pulled out. When the self has been shattered and fragmented, as it has been for many of us, collecting the fragments, believing they belong to us, and naming them as good is a politically rebellious, spiritually powerful, and biomedically healing practice.
Yeah, this chapter on the body as the site of oppression, I feel like this book would be incomplete without it, because it highlights the very real, very harmful consequences of this mind-body separation that started thousands of years ago. Like, this is what it does to people. I really appreciated that, and the acknowledgement that being an quote-unquote other in some way puts a huge stress on your body and your nervous system.
So yeah, it kind of to wrap up our conversation, I think the big takeaways or whatever is that embodiment is vital for our survival. I liked how you put it, like this isn't just a good idea or a nice spiritual practice, but like actually something vital for our survival.
Like, if we're going to heal our society and ourselves, like, this is crucial. This is a crucial relationship that needs to be mended. It's very, very important.
Yeah. And how they're already so intricately connected that it's not necessarily, it's like rebuilding the relationship and also just recognizing that it exists.
Yeah.
Like our bodies are constantly giving information to our brains, and then our brain interprets it and tells us to think something. And then our bodies hear our thoughts and respond to it. I can think about, and maybe it's a mindful practice for me that I find helpful sometimes, is thinking about what my body is doing when I'm feeling something. And be like, okay, this is my body sending a signal to my brain that something is happening there. This is my brain interpreting what's happening. I can also use my eyes. I can use touch. I can use feelings to identify like what's happening in my body and fixating on that instead of fixating on like a mind loop of like, I'm uncomfortable, or like, you did this to yourself, you did this to yourself, like, it's your problem. You should be fine. Instead of like just letting myself experience bodily sensations and feelings. Yeah. All that to say, there really is no separation. They're already so connected. Part of embodiment is just recognizing how connected our mind and body are.
I really like the image of it as a relationship because I think it's still really difficult to think of my body as me. But I can think of her as another person who has been hurt and like needs my love and compassion and support and to be taken seriously. Like, I can think about that and caring for this other being that is very, very close to me. Yeah, all the stuff that she has about it being a relationship that feels like a good place to start, even if I can't always like identify with it. But yeah, overall, so many good things. I think we definitely both learned a lot.
Yeah. So a few recommendations. We mentioned this already, but the book You're a Miracle and a Pain in the Ass by Mike McHargue is wonderful. I mean, Mike is actually a friend of Dr. McBride. She references him in this book.
Yeah.
He references her in his book. They're like great friends. Some of the concepts are like repeated, but Mike McHargue has his own take on it and is from a different approach and angle than Dr. McBride as a psychologist. But wonderful book as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then I really enjoy the Headspace meditation app. We talked a lot about pain in this episode. So they have a specific meditation called Pain in the Night, which I have used several times when I've woken up with pain or discomfort or even just trying to fall asleep when you have like a stuffy nose. I think it's been helpful for me. So I'll just point anyone there if they're looking for some meditation tools, if it's something you want to incorporate into your own embodiment practices.
And then I would just recommend The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Similar concepts. It's longer and it's about trauma. So yeah. It's pretty heavy stuff, but it's also good if you want more knowledge about embodiment.
So what things are you currently obsessed with? What's bringing you joy this week?
Well, there is a new podcast called Parks and Recollection that is exactly what it sounds like. It's one of the actors, Rob Lowe, and one of the writers, Alan Yang, from Parks and Recreation, going through each episode of the show and bringing on all the writers and creators and producers. It's a great time. They're doing a great job with it so far. Big Mouth, season 5. I watched it in 24 hours. They knock it out of the park every time, and I can't recommend it enough. And I love that Victoria's finally watching it.
I know. I'm like, we're on season 3. We're getting there.
Yeah. I'm like, you might get to season 5 in like a year. I don't know. But you're moving through it pretty fast.
I probably watched like anywhere from like 4 to 7 episodes a week since we started watching it, which is like a pretty quick pace for myself, I will say.
Wow. I'm very impressed. I'm very excited when you get to it. And then there's a new Amine album called 2.5. It's my favorite of his albums since his first one, Good For You. He just tried a very different production style. Like, it's very new for him. The songs are very different, but I really like them. They're a little too short. I want them to be longer. But yeah, I really like it. I want to listen to it all the way through every time.
I've been also enjoying Taco Chronicles. It's a TV show on Netflix. Each episode is about a different taco.
I love that.
It's been great. I also went and saw No Time to Die, the new James Bond movie in theaters, which I'm not a huge, like, James Bond fan, but I don't know, the movie was really fun. They go a lot of cool places. It's beautifully shot, and I don't know, I just like going to the movies again. It's nice.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Hillary McBride, for this journey that we've just been on.
And thanks for the advanced reading copy. I'm so flattered.
If you ever want anything, ever, just ask.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julia and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at Book Club with JV, on our website, bookclubwithjv.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasme provides us with project management support. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fabland. Until next time, happy reading.